Why did I just take a sip of coffee right after starting recording? What was the point in that? Whatever. So, walking simulators. They get a pretty bad rep, don't they? I mean, the term itself reeks of derogatory language, first coined as it was as a snarky description of DayZ of all games, due to that game's tendency to devolve into copious amounts of walking from A to B. Pretty loose description, huh? I mean, on that basis, the two biggest games in the world right now are walking simulators too. But of course, we all know what the term has come to mean, don't we? Narrative-centric games with little to no real gameplay, and the primary objective is simply to walk. Whether you consider that to be a good thing or a bad thing is, at the end of the day, entirely down to the player, and the mindset that they have going in. So like many people, my first experience with the genre was Dear Esther. It would have been late 2012, I was still riding the high of Dark Souls and Bastion, and was still looking for games with less than clear-cut stories to spend my time picking over and analysing. I believe it was the Escapist forums where I got recommended Dear Esther, and aside from the fact that it had a somewhat interesting narrative, I had absolutely no idea what to expect going in. For those who haven't played it, Dear Esther only takes about 90 minutes to complete if you're being generous. Throughout the game you literally just walk across a landscape, hear a few voices, see a few visions, and then climb a tower. I remember thinking at the time that it was a novel concept, but not something I'd want to play for long periods of time. The game is the length of a short movie, and for a strictly narrative-based experience, that's just fine. But while the game's story was suitably thought-provoking and there was some nice scenery to take in along the way, looking back at the game now it just seems so empty. The movie analogy seems apt to me. Barely interactable, plot-driven, audio-visual experience like Dear Esther has more in common with watching a film than playing a game. Your decisions ultimately don't matter. There's no life or death, win or lose struggle, no drive, no real interactability beyond the pace with which you progress the plot. And while Dear Esther obviously broke a lot of new ground with its approach to storytelling, there's no denying that it doesn't hold up to either medium. Watching a film will be better paced, more expansive, more dynamic. Playing a game will be more challenging, more involving, more, for want of a better word, fun. Dear Esther is the archetypal walking simulator, and the one most deserving of the name, for at the end of the day, walking is all you do. There have been plenty of games to ape the formula since then, of course. The best ones are built on the groundwork laid down by Dear Esther and taken the genre in some really unique directions, but then there are others which didn't do that. While Steam is overflowing with cheap quote-unquote narrative experiences, a big name example of this is Gone Home. I know that game got a lot of hate for daring to mention that lesbians exist, but there are far bigger flaws with the game than that. Throughout the game's 2+ hour duration, you walk around an inexplicably empty house, reading notes. I mean, I guess that makes it slightly more interactable than Dear Esther, but the teenage romance plot, well voice acted and pleasantly heartwarming as it is overall way too shallow and too stereotypical to keep a player invested for 2 entire hours. And I don't want to single out Gone Home here. It's hardly the most egregious milking of the walking simulator genre that I've seen, but it is a prime example of how not to do it. Another prime example of a walker with a severe limp is the Chinese room's follow-up to Dear Esther, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, during which you walk around and hear snippets of a story far more interesting than the one you're actually getting to play through. I honestly never even finished Egg Tutor, but thanks to the title I think I can hazard a guess as to what happens. Unless of course, The Rapture is just the name of some ultra-hip new coffee shop or something. And here's the thing. It doesn't take much to make one of these games go from being a boring slog to a memorable experience. Take another of the great early walkers, 2012's Journey by That Game Company. If I'm honest, Journey has one of the weakest plots in modern gaming, which is a bold choice for a genre which is so heavily tied to narrative, but here's the thing. It looks great, it has a breathtaking soundtrack, and it's an absolute joy to control as your little guy slides, leaps and flies around the simple yet charming little world. The multiplayer element too adds a lot without impacting the feel of the base game. The simple cheeps and jumps you use to interact with your fellow traveller allows players to build a special sort of camaraderie which text or voice chat would only have shattered in an instant. Meanwhile, other games are adding their own twist to the formula. The Stanley Parable stood out from a crowd due to its own unique brand of off-kilter humour and ability to predict everything the player might do within its own limited scope. Does the player go around obsessively trying to interact with everything? The game will comment on it. Does the player repeatedly go out of their way to avoid taking the intended route? The narrator will have a passive-aggressive meltdown and drop them into a game of Minecraft instead. Attention to detail is what elevates a good game to a great game, and the Stanley Parable has this in spades. Elsewhere, The Unfinished Swan uses its unique painting mechanic to initially allow the player to navigate an otherwise perfectly white environment, and later evolves into a puzzle-solving tool as the game seemingly constructs itself around you. Speaking of which, the Magic Circle places the player in a game within a game, giving them control over the programming of the elements they encounter to the degree that enjoyment can be found in simply trying things out. To the Moon and its various sequels and side projects fuses two of the most tired tropes in video gaming. This is the walking simulator and the RPG Maker game, and somehow produces one of the most powerful, heartfelt games of all time. The honesty of the dialogue, the clarity of the sound design, and the ingenuity of the story in this game allow a handful of simple sprites to feel more believable and empathetic than any fully voice-acted, beautifully rendered AAA protagonist has managed in years. And then on the other end of the spectrum, games like Soma and Layers of Fear use psychological horror elements alongside your standard walking simulator setup in order to make the player feel helpless. A gamble which is often more missed than hit, but when used effectively can create some of the most truly terrifying moments in gaming history. I guess what I'm trying to say here is, games don't need to be all high-octane, non-stop action in order to be enjoyable. Gaming still has a long way to go to rival cinema or literature, but we have plenty of examples of how a compelling narrative can be woven around an interactive medium without the need for arbitrary gamification which only serves to derail the pace of the plot. I mean, take World of Warcraft. There's a game with a huge, expansive lore behind it, which is so often forgotten that most of its player base would struggle to even summarise it. To say the story takes a back seat to the gameplay is an understatement. The story is sat at the back of the bus, while nearly every other seat is taken up by checklists of boar tusks to collect and dungeons to complete. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I've come to believe that certain allowances need to be made in order for narrative and gameplay to live in harmony, and the best walking simulators are perhaps the best examples of how to reach this equilibrium. Let me close off by talking a little about a game which I think hits that sweet spot more accurately than most. What Remains of Edith Finch was a game released last year which I actually would have played on this channel if I'd only got around to getting the ball rolling a few weeks earlier. Instead, and perhaps for the better, I played it on my own over a couple of days last summer, prior to starting my first term at university. The story, and not to get too spoilery here because if you haven't played this, I'm suggesting that you go do so, it focuses on a young woman, the titular Edith Finch, returning to her family home after the death of her mother. As you explore the rooms of the sprawling, deserted homestead, you are treated to a set of self-contained stories about the misadventures of the various ancestors who once lived there. Each one ties back to Edith's central narrative in some way, and each one is distinctive, both in tone and in gameplay mechanics. While never overly taxing, these constant changes in pace, in feel, and in narrative style keep the game feeling fresh and exciting, keep you from getting bogged down in one multiple-hour, tonally monotone story, and most importantly, keeps you wanting to know what happens next. Honestly, if you haven't checked this title out, even if you haven't enjoyed walking simulators in the past, I'd recommend giving it a look. I admit these types of games aren't for everyone, but as a proponent of the whole games are art ideology, I like to think that games can move forwards into an era where they're not just seen as overblown toys for kids, but as an actual powerful medium for sharing ideas and creating memorable stories which stick with you longer than a kill streak ever could. After all, surely if a movie can be compelling, then a movie with a degree of player agency can only be more so. To sum it all up, I understand that walking simulators get a bad rep, and I understand why. Some of what cynically gets churned out under that tag just seems like an excuse to not have to program any actual gameplay into your game. But I also think they have their place, and that when they're at their best, they're advancing the medium into new and exciting territory where your more classically gamey games would struggle to ever go. But that's just my hot opinions on the matter. Now, can I have kudos for getting through all that without using the term ludonarrative dissonance?